On May 2, 1945, the city of Berlin woke up in the midst of a gloomy silence. After days under constant bombardment by Soviet artillery, things were finally starting to calm down. What reigned was the peace of the cemetery, and all Germans were aware that it was the end of an era. The Third Reich was dead. After weeks of hunger and deprivation, many Germans took to the streets to search for the carcasses of the horses, which they dismembered and took home to cook. Meanwhile, in Adolf Hitler's bunker, located under the Chancellery building, few people remained.
Most had fled or committed suicide, as was the case with the Führer himself. One of those who still remained there was Johannes Henschel, an engineer in charge of operating the generators that provided water, light and ventilation to the underground complex. The only reason he stayed in his place was because, above the bunker, there was a hospital for the wounded from the fight against the Soviets. In order for electrical power to reach the establishment, it was necessary for Henschel to stay at his post. The engineer was impatient and nervous, imagining what the communists would do to him once they caught him. After a few hours, he heard the sound of the hatch opening and voices speaking Russian coming towards him. It was a group of women from the Red Army Medical Corps. The leader asked him, in rudimentary German, where Hitler was. Henschel replied that the Führer had committed suicide and that his body was buried in the garden of the Chancellery, located above.
They nodded without much interest, and then asked, "Where is Eva Braun?
Where are her clothes?" Many years later, the engineer recalled the situation this way. "It was then that I realized what the Russians wanted." As always, the spoils went to the hands of the victors. After months of fighting a terrible war, those women were just looking for some decent civilian clothes, so I took them to Eva Braun's dressing room. Russian doctors were not overly curious to discover the last whereabouts of Hitler.
However, at the same time, Soviet intelligence officers were conducting a desperate search for the body of the Führer.
Finding him was a crucial task. Without the body, there was still the possibility that the dictator had escaped the bunker and was on his way to another country.
Stalin would not rest until he was sure that his enemy was definitely dead.
By April 1945, Red Army tanks reached the outskirts of Berlin, bringing with them a barrage of death and destruction. The city was reduced to a smoking pile of ruins, while the defenders barely managed to hold off the Soviet offensive. Hitler had withdrawn to his bunker, and on April 22, in the midst of a conference with Wehrmacht commanders, he suffered a nervous breakdown. He accused the generals of cowards and traitors, and finally admitted that the war was lost. Despite being implored to flee, he announced that he would stay in the city and take his own life. A week later he married his wife, Eva Braun, in a small ceremony in the map room. It was a gloomy event, far from any kind of happiness, since the couple knew that their hours were numbered. The Führer's last instructions to his subordinates were precise: "Under no circumstances allow my body or my belongings to fall into the hands of the Russians." His greatest fear was that his body would end up like that of Benito Mussolini, lynched and sullied by communist partisans. On April 30, Hitler and his wife went to his personal office and committed suicide. They both ingested cyanide capsules, although he, to save himself from suffering from the poison, placed a pistol to his temple and pulled the trigger. The shot resounded throughout the bunker, and within minutes the bodies were found. They were immediately wrapped in blankets and taken up to the Chancellery Gardens. The process was carried out by a young SS officer, Heinz Ling, who nearly found no fuel for the cremation. However, he managed to gather a few cans of gasoline, sprayed the corpses and lit them. The impromptu funeral was interrupted by Soviet artillery fire, forcing them to flee and return to the safety of the bunker. 12 hours later, the Wehrmacht presented its official surrender to the Russians, reporting that the dictator had taken his own life.
For the Soviets, however, the news was not enough. They wanted to have the body in their hands. Stalin suspected that the Führer was alive and that he had managed to escape. In fact, during those hours he looked doubtful, repeating the same phrase over and over again: Hitler's death is a fascist trick. As we told you at the beginning of the video, on the morning of May 2nd, the Red Army entered the bunker. The first to arrive were the women from the medical corps, who were more interested in ransacking Eva Braun's wardrobe than finding the remains of the Nazi leader. By then, the lair was practically empty. A group of Soviet sappers searched the complex for booby traps, although there were none. Next, it was the turn of C0RPSE, the Russian counterintelligence unit, whose duty it was to identify the dictator's body. At sunset, they found 2 half-burned corpses in the garden, although they soon realized that they were not the ones they were looking for. One of them had a twisted foot, so it had to be Joseph Goebbels, famous for his misshapen limb. Beside him lay his wife, wearing a gold cigarette case, a Nazi party insignia, and a gold brooch. Hitler, however, was still missing. On May 3rd, they found, under a water tank in the garden, the remains of someone who closely resembled the Führer. However, upon careful inspection, they noticed that his socks were torn and mended. It seemed unlikely that the most powerful man in Germany would dress like that, so they ruled out that this was his corpse. The next day, they found a couple of bodies badly buried in the crater left by a bomb. The C0RPSE commander, guided by his intuition, ordered them to be placed in 2 empty ammunition boxes and taken to a hospital outside Berlin for examination. All the Germans in the bunker who were arrested claimed that Hitler had shot himself. Now, it was time to collect the evidence to make sure of it. Between May 7th and 9th, a Soviet forensic team found glass splinters in the mouths of the 2 corpses. This was an indication that they had chewed cyanide tablets before dying and did not coincide with the version that he had died from a shot to the head. For this reason, they tracked down his dentist's assistant, named Kathy Huserman, who kept the dictator's dental x-rays. This is how they found that it was the remains of Hitler and his wife. Later, when going through the studio where he committed suicide again, fragments of a human skull were found, that is, the wound typically produced by a bullet passing through a head. There was no doubt that the Führer had ingested the poison and then, when it began to take effect, he pulled the trigger. Despite the fact that he knew the truth of what happened, Stalin dedicated himself to sowing disinformation among the Western powers. In numerous meetings with American and English politicians, he suggested that Hitler had managed to escape and was perhaps in Spain or Japan. The aim was to create uncertainty and weaken ties between capitalist countries, which would look at each other with suspicion. The Soviet strategy was successful, as all kinds of wild rumors immediately spread. Some said that the Führer had escaped in a submarine to Antarctica, others said that he fled by plane to Argentina, where he was hidden by President Juan Domingo Perón. Many claim to have seen him walking the streets of places as diverse as Chicago, California, Bariloche, Bogota, or Madrid. In reality, the bodies of Hitler and Eva Braun were secretly buried in Buck, north of Berlin. Subsequently, they would be exhumed on several occasions and relocated to areas guarded by the Red Army. In 1970, the head of the Soviet intelligence service, Yuri Andropov, made the decision to destroy the remains forever. They were placed on a pyre and cremated, after which the ashes were scattered in the Biederitz River in central Germany. In this way, they ensured that, by not having an official grave, the neo-Nazis would not have a sanctuary where they could pay homage to the dictator. However, the Soviet Union never confirmed that Hitler had died, preferring to watch all kinds of speculation about his fate gain weight. At present, there are various theories that affirm that the Führer survived the Second War and lived peacefully under a false identity. Although they do not have the endorsement of specialists, they are believed by a large part of the public. Thank you very much for joining us until the end. Stay tuned for our next video.